Chapter 8: The Alpha City Accomplishment. The resident population became involved in every aspect of managing the complex, including all the financial decisions and all of the outside world business decisions. Responsibility was intentionally shifted from the managing entity, as we will call it, to the residents, who decided how things were done and what things were done. Everything was openly discussed. When there were disagreements, compromises were worked out, or voting decided outcomes when necessary. Alpha City changed from a corporate dictatorship to a democracy of residents. The entire venture would ultimately succeed or fail based on resident commitment and the community's ability to govern itself as a group. Workforce functions expanded into administration aspects, and management incorporated itself into the workforce, intentionally and purposefully blurring the line between the two. Martin tells us, quote, "An official constitution was drawn up in order to keep the cooperativist philosophies and principles in place, to keep it from deteriorating into those with power and those without, to keep everyone in the community on an equal footing. The job rotation system was a key element to this end. Like all other workforce functions, administrative positions were rotated and therefore temporary. This ensured that no one person or group was in any controlling position long enough to gain any sort of advantage. It also ensured that all residents had experience in these functions, making it difficult to hide any foul play, favoritism, or misuse of power. There were no secret dealings. The administrative functions were completely transparent to the entire community. Governing was put into the hands of the population as a whole, rather than being entrusted to a small group of elected or appointed administrators. We set up a voting system whereby residents were able to vote on every issue. This was all handled through the computer network and could be monitored in a completely transparent way by the residents. In Alpha City, voting was not done anonymously. Everyone took open and public responsibility for how they voted. Everyone could visibly see how their vote and everyone else's was recorded. And because of this open voting policy and transparency, coupled with a regular administrative rotation system, any sort of fraud would most likely be quite obvious and easily exposed." End quote. One of the residents writes, quote, "No one is in competition in this system. We aren't competing for positions or jobs or money or power. We are all interested in making this system work. No one has the power to force anyone else to do, or, as the case may be, not do anything. People's pay or jobs cannot be threatened as in the outside world. However, peer pressure is extremely powerful in this type of atmosphere, and open-mindedness is a strongly encouraged and cultivated virtue here. Most major disputes are ultimately resolved by referring back to our Constitution, in which we clearly define the cooperativist principles and Alpha City objectives. It is often grounding for us to continually keep those in mind. It gets us back on track and guides us with difficult decisions. It has been very advantageous for us to be a select collection of individuals, ones that have the same goals with regard to Alpha City and cooperativism. I'm not sure this would work with any randomly selected group of individuals or segment of any given society." End quote. Another resident makes this point, quote, "We all want credit for our contributions and our accomplishments. We all want credit for our ideas. This is one of the utmost priorities in this system. It is considered a basic human need and recognized cornerstone of cooperativism, giving people a great deal of incentive to want to share ideas." End quote. Another observation by a longtime resident reads as follows, quote, "Our purpose is to create an environment that gives everyday life a freedom for discovering and enjoying whatever one feels most interested in doing, with a support group of those having similar interests, but without the burden of monetary cost or inability to access the resources necessary for such activity. Any sort of bureaucracy is highly discouraged. Straightforward simplicity is always the first choice in any workforce endeavors, especially when it comes to administrative functions." End quote. Next, we have a resident's perspective on how the interaction of residents and guests changed during these times. Quote, "Alpha City's entire dynamic expanded from a vacation resort to an urban center. Its philosophy toward paying visitors, guests, changed as well. It was a philosophy somewhat at odds with the mainstream prevailing customer service philosophy of business at that time, that the customer is always right. That type of policy was geared to going out of one's way to please the customers in order to increase business and therefore profits. This in turn encouraged the general public, the customers, to feel justified in being more and more demanding and unreasonable at times. Their money gave them that power. Their money, viewed as a potential sale, granted them the right to be demanding. Employees were expected to be accommodating, subservient, and tolerant. In keeping with a cooperatist philosophy, Alpha City's policy with regard to this was one of mutual respect. Residents were expected to be respectful of guests at all times, as well as fellow residents. However, at Alpha City, guests were also expected to be respectful of residents. It was not always a case of the customer is always right simply because they were paying. Money was not a worshipped god in Alpha City. It did not supersede or trump being respectful to others. It did not condone unreasonable, demanding, or unruly behavior. Residents were not there to serve the guests. They were not employees. They were residents. This was their home. They maintained the smooth operation of the complex for everyone, guests and residents alike, and attempted to assist the guests in the full enjoyment of their stay. Residents were not required to dote on, cater to, or accommodate particularly unreasonable or overly demanding guests. All reasonable efforts were made to make a guest's stay as enjoyable and as memorable as possible, but there was a line that, if crossed, would not be tolerated. This would be similar to having a guest stay with you at your residence. You may go out of your way to make them feel at home and comfortable and do whatever was reasonable to have them enjoy their stay. However, you would not put up with outrageous, unfair, and unreasonable demands. At Alpha City, guests were not paying for the right to be demanding. They were paying for the opportunity to participate briefly in a unique community. The guests were always free to leave with a refund of whatever was reasonable based on the length of time they had already stayed. Alpha City was able to set these boundaries for guests because it was a non-issue for 95% of them. Most people were delighted with their stay and treatment by the residents. Hard to please guests, those individuals who were incessant complainers, never happy with anything, were actually detrimental to the enjoyment of the other 95% who would find it irksome if certain guests were given extra privilege or special treatment simply because they were overly demanding. The difference between guests and residents was simply that guests paid a fee to stay there and were not subject to participating in the workforce. The residents stayed permanently without a fee, but were expected to participate in the workforce. End quote. Outside industries and services were heavily relied on in the initial construction and operation of the resort. This contracting of outside services spiked the economy of the surrounding areas, bringing with it jobs and a boon of financial prosperity. As decades passed and Alpha City became more self-reliant, the need for outside services gradually declined. However, the surrounding communities still prospered from the tourism. In addition, as Alpha City expanded and produced more and more internally, it was able to reduce the cost of living for the outside communities. It began providing cheaper power and water from its own on-site facilities. Agricultural produce, tools, appliances, textiles, electronic equipment, and a host of other necessities for modern life would be sold to the outlying communities at a fraction of what they would pay under the normal Belgian economy. Resident Sally Osterman writes this, quote, "Due to the changing business landscape in these surrounding communities, businesses would relocate or close their doors. Local residents seeking new employment would follow the jobs and sell their homes. In this way, Alpha City was able to acquire new land and expand its borders. Often these local residents would request to join the Alpha City community and become commuting Alpha City residents. For this to happen, they would sell their home to Alpha City. Then, if they chose to, they would continue to live there and commute into the city to participate in the workforce. They would enjoy full resident privileges just as if they lived in one of the on-site residences. Their house officially became an off-site Alpha City residence. As larger portions of outlying communities became commuting members, whole areas became officially part of the city, expanding its borders. And as the borders expanded, so did the transportation and utility systems. Ultra-modern rail and monorail systems were built to reach the new areas so that commuter transportation was free for these residents. Many of the former residents of these surrounding communities who sold their homes to Alpha City and who were then able to join the Alpha City community gladly parted with their old homesteads in favor of moving to the modern city residences. This then opened up opportunities for the city residents to swap to these more rural settings as a change of pace. This free mobility was common under this new system. If one wanted to change living quarters, one could be put on a list on a first-come, first-served basis and simply move to a new location as something became available. Some residents stayed where they were for many years, whereas others enjoyed moving to a new location on a regular basis. No one was ever stuck where they were due to financial concerns. There were no longer any financial concerns. As the boundaries of the city expanded, all new territory was carefully and thoughtfully incorporated into the overall design of the Alpha City legacy. However, the workforce designers and developers often found ways to uphold the individual charm and personality of these new communities. They found ways to enhance it amidst the modernization of its transportation and utilities." End quote.